Old Time Tales present a film strip flashback.
Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson is the exciting story of David Balfour, of his many adventures, and of his narrow escape from disaster. While this
Enjoy the
thrilling
show.
adventure is truly a work of the author's imagination, it is also valid to class it as an historical novel, because both the plot and mood describe 18th century Scotland. Although Robert Louis Stevenson lived during the 19th century, he portrays a time when part of Scotland was in rebellion against the King of England. And some of the characters David meets in his journeys come right from this historical setting in which violence and bloodshed were common. Indeed, the murder related in the story really occurred. Historical records refer to it as the Appin murder. Part of the reason for Robert Louis Stevenson's intense interest in adventure stories is that in real life, he was a very sick man who, despite his illness, remained cheerful and curious about the world. Then, too, he was blessed with a vivid imagination. So he would often invent exciting stories, which as a boy he was unable to experience because of bad health. He did, however, travel extensively, including a 3-year trip around the Pacific Ocean, writing a series of syndicated articles. Eventually, he settled down with his family in far-off Samoa, where he died in 1894, when only 44 years old. By then, he had written 2 of the most famous adventure stories ever published, Treasure Island and Kidnapped. Now to David Balfour, the hero of Kidnapped. It seems that at his father's death in 1751, David Balfour left his native village in Scotland for the first time. Now that both his parents were dead, he had no home. So early one morning, David started down the road, ready to begin a new life at 17 years old. Along the way, he met the minister, who was not surprised to learn David was leaving. After reassuring himself that David had eaten breakfast before setting out on his journey, Mr. Campbell, the minister, gave David a letter left him by his father a short time before he died. He had told this kind man to send his son David with the letter to the house of Shaws. The minister knew little about the house and its occupants, except that David's father had been born there. It was all a great mystery, and David pondered what a poor man like his father had to do with the owner of the house of Shaws. According to Mr. Campbell, David's full name was Balfour of Shaws, and the letter was addressed to Ebenezer Balfour of Shaws, David's uncle. Although David had never heard of this uncle and wondered what he would be like, he was even more curious to learn the contents of the letter, especially when the minister said that the letter contained something about David's inheritance. But before sending David off, the minister drew a picture of the house so that David would be able to recognize it. Then he dug into his pocket and pulled out 4 gifts for David. Some money left him by his father, plus 3 presents from the minister and his wife, a shilling piece, a Bible, and some medical instructions. David pocketed his gifts and started out. On the way, he had to stop several times to ask directions. To his distress, everyone of whom David asked the way warned him against his uncle. And the last person he met, a stout, dark woman, was so shocked by his question that she began to scream. From the top of the hill where she and David stood, the woman pointed to a large house that was falling into ruin. "That is the house of Shaws," she cried. "Blood built it. Blood shall bring it down." With these words, the woman ran away. Despite these unexpected responses, David had gone too far to turn back. He finally reached his uncle's house. The longer he looked at the building, the worse it appeared. One wing had never been finished, and the bats flew in and out of the windows. David approached the door and knocked. After repeated knockings at the door, his uncle, a strange-looking man, let him in. A rifle was in his hand. As he led the way to the kitchen, David thought, what a frightening place. He saw everything with a quick glance, for except for a half-dozen dishes on a shelf, a couple of locked chests, and a table, the room was empty. Uncle Ebenezer drank a jug of beer that was on the table himself, but offered David a bowl of cold porridge. With difficulty, he swallowed a few spoonfuls before Ebenezer took the bowl away and finished what was left. David wondered what this evil uncle had to do with his future. That night, David asked his uncle about the inheritance. In answer, Ebenezer gave him 40 pounds in gold coins. Knowing him to be a miser, David was suspicious. Still, he couldn't prove he was entitled to more, so he accepted the coins. Then Ebenezer sent David to the tower to fetch some papers. This was no easy task, for there was no light and David could not see. Cautiously, he crawled up the stairs. Suddenly, there was a clash of thunder and a flash of lightning. In an instant, David saw that the tower was never completed, and he was within inches of falling to his death. Ebenezer had meant to kill him. Quickly, David ran back to his uncle. He demanded to know about the inheritance. At last, his uncle promised to take David to see Mr. Rankeilor, the family lawyer. In fact, the uncle said he had some business with a sea captain in Queen's Ferry, and they could see to both visits at the same time. So, the next day they set out for Queen's Ferry. When they got there, Uncle Ebenezer went to the inn to look for the captain. As David waited outside, he began to talk to the landlord. From remarks by the landlord, David realized that his father had been the oldest son and rightful heir to the Shaw inheritance. Therefore, the estate, and whatever money there was, rightfully belonged to him now. After a time, Ebenezer and the captain came out to go down to the dock to look at the captain's ship, the Covenant. On the way, David was tricked by Ebenezer and Captain Hoseason into boarding the Covenant. For as they were walking, the captain whispered to David that he wanted to warn him about his uncle. In order to talk, David agreed to board the ship. Once on deck, David and the captain started to walk around when suddenly something hit David on the head. As he lay unconscious, the ship sailed away with David a prisoner. When he came to, David found himself bound hand and foot. His head was pounding and he was covered with sweat. Everything seemed to have turned against him. Days passed, during which the only person who befriended him was Mr. Ryach, the second officer, who had found him feverish and had obtained the captain's permission to move him to his cabin. There he nursed David back to health. While he recuperated, David had an opportunity to learn about his companions on the ship. One day was very much like another until Mr. Shuan, the first officer, in a drunken rage, beat the cabin boy to death. Although sane when sober, he turned cruel and violent when drunk. This time, however, his victim would never recover. Yet Captain Hoseason insisted that no one on land must know what happened. Instead, they would be told that the boy fell overboard. To fill the void, David became the new cabin boy. This job was not difficult, for all it involved was serving the meals. The rest of the time, David had to himself. For the next week, activities aboard ship continued more or less as normal. But the cloud of ill luck that had begun with the murder continued. First, the weather began to get bad until it was almost impossible to see. The fog became so dense that one night the Covenant ran down a small boat. At the time, David was serving Mr. Ryach and the captain dinner. Suddenly, there was a loud sound and the cry of voices. The three men ran to the deck, just in time to see a small boat sink to the bottom with her crew. Only one man was saved, Alan Breck, a Highlander of Scotland. At the moment of the collision, the stern of the doomed boat had been thrown high in the air. Alan had leaped up and caught hold of the Covenant's bow, thereby saving himself. The first thing one noticed about him was the elegant red coat and the pair of fine silver-mounted pistols he wore. As a member of the Stuart clan, one of the largest and most violent Scottish families, he naturally favored King James over the Hanoverian King George. To return to Scotland now would mean death. Therefore, Allen demanded that Captain Hoseason set him ashore in France. But the captain would only agree to take him back to Scotland, even when Allen promised him 60 guineas from the money he carried from loyal Scots to further the cause of Scotland in her rebellion against England. In those days, that was almost $1,000. The captain nodded in agreement. However, he was a sly man and not to be trusted. Fortunately for Allen, David overheard the captain and his officers planning to seize Allen for the money. But first it was necessary to get the rifles which were hidden in the cabin Allen was using. So when the captain saw David, he decided to let him join in the plot. Since it would be natural for a cabin boy to check the cabinets, Allen would never suspect David. But instead, David warned Allen of the plot. There was no choice but to help him, for David could not be a partner to murder. Besides, David himself was a victim of kidnapping. The two, therefore, chose to defend themselves. Together, they waited for the crew to try to enter the cabin, and together they held the ship's crew at bay. Allen took care of the main door while David guarded the back one. It was a bloody fight that ended in death for Mr. Shewan and others. It was obvious that Allen and David had won. So the next day, the captain made a truce. Once more, Allen asked to be put ashore. This was not easy because the ship was in water filled with dangerous reefs. In the end, the Covenant was tossed violently onto the reefs. Later, the ship broke apart on a reef, and David and Allen were separated. David was thrown clear of the ship into the sea. Struggling to keep above water, he finally made it to the shore of an islet, and from there to the mainland. After several misadventures, David arrived in Scotland, where he learned that a civil war was in progress. Two clans, the Campbells and the Stuarts, were fighting each other. No doubt Allen, as a Stuart, was involved in the fighting. Although David did not side with Allen's cause, he was determined to find him. On the way, David met 4 men. One of them was the Scot known as Red Fox. A few days later, David found Allen deep in the highlands. As the leader of the Campbells, Red Fox was hated by Allen. And now they were near Auchan, where Allen's clan lived. Suddenly, Red Fox was killed by an unknown man. Immediately, David fled to the woods. When he found Allen hiding there, he was deeply troubled until his friend reassured him that he had not killed Red Fox. His sole crime was deserting the King of England's army because he did not believe Scotland should be governed by England. Still, Allen feared capture because the punishment for desertion was death. At this, David agreed to flee the highlands with Allen and escape to the lowlands. Once there, he would return to the House of Shaws. To escape capture, David and Allen hid by day and traveled by night. Every so often, Allen would stop at a house of a friend to tell him of Red Fox's death. Instead of being pleased, his friends were worried because they were Stuarts and feared being punished for the crime. At one house, Allen and David learned that Allen was accused of killing Red Fox and that a 100-pound reward for their arrest had been posted. In the weeks that followed, they had numerous close calls. When they finally reached Queen's Ferry, David went to see Mr. Rankeillor. Since it would be safer if David went alone to the lawyer, Allen hid in the fields by the roadside to wait. Having agreed on a signal, the two separated. Fortunately, David arrived at the lawyer's just as he was leaving. David told his story. The lawyer was convinced of the boy's honesty, so he promised to help him. Rather reluctantly, he also agreed to help Allen. But first, David should bathe and clean up. Once this was done, David returned to the sitting room to hear about his family from Mr. Rankeillor. He told David that his father had married the woman whom Ebenezer loved as well. Because Ebenezer was so dejected to learn that the woman of his dreams preferred his older brother to himself, David's father had given up his inheritance as the oldest son in favor of Ebenezer. That is why, while Ebenezer lived in luxury at Shaw, David's family lived and died poor folk. Those who did not know the true story accused Ebenezer of murdering his brother. As a result, David's uncle withdrew from people and thought of nothing but his money. He became a miser. Without a doubt, the estate belonged to David. Yet the lawyer advised him to try to make a settlement with his uncle. David agreed and thought of a plan. Later, Allen tricked Ebenezer into confessing that he had arranged David's kidnapping by telling Ebenezer that Captain Hoseason had told him about their meeting. In this way, Ebenezer was forced to confess. Meanwhile, David and Mr. Rankiler were outside and heard Ebenezer's confession. So did the lawyer's clerk, who they had taken the precaution to have with them. At the right moment, the three eavesdroppers stepped forward. Ebenezer was stricken dumb when he realized that he had made a confession before witnesses. He was afraid he would be arrested, for kidnapping was a serious crime. Besides, he knew that his claim to the inheritance would not be upheld in a court of law. He therefore agreed to make a special arrangement with David. He offered David 2/3 of the yearly income from the land, which amounted to considerable money. Since it would provide him with a secure future, David agreed to this settlement. As far as he was concerned, his own affairs were finally settled. However, Allen was still a problem. As long as he remained in Scotland, he could not breathe safely. So, with this money, David helped Allen escape from Scotland to France, where he would be free. The two friends regretted parting, but they knew it was best. With Allen on his way to safety, David headed for the city of Edinburgh and a new life. Thus ends Robert Louis Stevenson's famous novel, Kidnapped.
The end. Hey folks, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the show, please like, share, and subscribe. Cheers.